Começou.
Ok, parece que estamos ao vivo. Muito bem, pessoal. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Essa é o segundo ciclo de palestras da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. E hoje nós temos um convidado muito especial. A palestra toda vai ser em inglês, então eu vou introduzir o convidado em inglês também. Mas o Denis fala português, então se você tiver alguma pergunta no final da palestra e quiser fazer em português, pode escrever em português, pode escrever em francês também, que ele entende, ou em inglês também. Eu sou José Carlos Camillo, eu sou doutorando em filosofia na UFG, a Universidade Federal de Goiás, e eu estudo a acurácia da memória episódica. Eu convidei então o Denis Perrin. So I'm gonna introduce the invited speaker. So Denis Perrin is a philosophy professor at the Université Grenoble-Alpes. He's also the director of the Institute of Philosophy, the Grenoble, and member of the Center for Philosophy of Memory, all from the Université Grenoble-Alpes. He has a authored book called Qu'est-ce que c'est souvenir, in which he discussed the definition of memory and remembering. And he more recently he's working mostly with the phenomenology of remembering. So you may be interested in his 2020 paper, in which he discussed that the phenomenology of memory is an epistemic feeling. More recently yet, he's working with the problem of déjà vu and déjà vécu. So you may check some of his papers. There are forthcoming on psychological philosophy or other journals. So Denis, thank you for accepting giving this talk, and the screen is yours.
Thanks a lot, José. I just want to share my presentation, which I can, here it is. Okay. And I will try to respect the 40-minute duration, I promise. Okay, so boa tarde para todos. The talk will be about the topic of the phenomenology of episodic remembering or episodic memory. Just let me check what I can. Yeah, okay. So let me introduce the topic of the talk. Episodic remembering is a certain type of mental state, and it's a conscious mental state. So it involves a distinct conscious experience. I give on the slide a quote by Tulving, in which he says, episodic memory's function is to make it possible for the rememberer to travel back in his or her mind to an earlier occasion and to mentally relive the experienced and thought about happenings. So if you accept that seems quite obvious. The question is, what is this experience, this conscious experience? Or using a term that is widely used in the literature, what is the phenomenology of episodic remembering? There has been a growing literature on that topic, in particular in the philosophy of memory literature. I must say that there is still no consensus on the topic, and I also think that there are still unexplored aspects of the phenomenology of this specific experience of episodically remembering. Of note, but I won't dwell on that today, there are even people in the philosophy of memory who consider that the very enterprise of trying to develop a phenomenology of episodic remembering is completely mistaken. And it's a real challenge to find the right way of developing such a type of study. So the first topic of the talk, the main topic, is the phenomenology of episodic remembering. That topic, I will tackle it from a specific angle. I will be interested in immersion. Immersion, quite intuitively at least, seems to be a feature of some of our quasi-perceptual states in particular. Take the example of reading a novel that captivates you, or take the example of a mind-wandering episode. In this kind of cases, you can be, if I use an intuitive way of describing the situation, you can be completely absorbed by the scene that you are imagining, be it in the case of reading a novel or in the case of an episode of mind wandering. So a question for someone who is interested in the phenomenology of consciousness in general is, what is immersion? And specifically, the question I will tackle in this talk regarding immersion is, what are the processes that underpin immersion, in particular in quasi-perceptual imagistic states like episodic remembering. The notion of immersion is a notion that has been used in different literatures, different areas, like anthropology, aesthetics, psychology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of art. But to the best of my knowledge, there is no consensual definition. So I will also try to provide at least some elements of definition in the talk. So what is the goal of a talk? The goal of a talk is to explore and bring together the following two neglected things. First, what I call the immersive phenomenology. I've just talked about phenomenology and about immersion. So one of the things I will be talking about is the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering. And it's a widely neglected feature of a phenomenology of such a type of mental states. And I will also talk about a neglected factor of the phenomenology of episodic remembering, at least in my view, namely attention. So I will explore and bring together these two things. Just let me say that this paper is, let's say, an exploratory, this talk, sorry, is an exploratory talk, because, I mean, both the immersive character of episodic remembering and the role of attention in episodic remembering are still unexplored topics. So it's really a first attempt to try to show the interest of these things. I just want to say also, maybe you have seen that on the title slide, that what I'm going to present today is in part due to a collaborative work with Mike Barkazi. We have a paper that is related to what I'm going to talk about today, a paper currently under review. Okay. So this is the goal of the talk. And how will I tackle this topic of the role of attention in the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering? Well, I will offer an abductive argument to say that attention actually has a role in this specific phenomenology. The argument will go as follows. First, I will argue that there is something to be explained, that is to say that there is a distinct immersive phenomenological feature of episodic remembering. Some people will disagree with me, and so we can come back to that during the Q&A, obviously. That will be the first premise. The second premise will say that attention plays an immersive role in quasi-perceptual imagistic mental states. And I will say more specifically that attention has processing properties through which I will define attention at that stage that confer an immersive character to the states in question. That will be the second premise. And the third premise will say that attention plays a role in the mental time travel phenomenology of episodic remembering, that is to say the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering. And more specifically, I will say that attention's processing properties that are immersive in other quasi-perceptual imagistic states are operative in episodic remembering. And then, therefore, I will conclude that it's likely that attention plays a role in the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering. The last stage of the argument will consist in a caveat, let's say, and it will say that, well, immersion is maybe due to other factors than attention. Okay, so let's get into it. And let's first consider the first premise that says that mental time travel is a distinct, immersive phenomenological feature of episodic remembering. Oh, the slide is a bit, sorry, distorted by the side. Okay, so like I said, episodic remembering is a conscious mental state. Then the question is, how many types of phenomenological features are characteristic or constitutive of this conscious mental state? On a widespread view, there are two sets of features that constitute the phenomenology of episodic remembering. First, you have first-order features, that is to say, that consist of the quasi-perceptual phenomenology of a state of episodic remembering. For instance, the spatial layout of the scene that you are remembering, the experiential perspective, the shapes and colors and sizes of the things that appear in the scene. And you also have second-order features, phenomenological features. Usually in the literature, at least some people argue that these features must be conceptualized in terms of epistemic or metacognitive feelings. For instance, the fact that when you are remembering, what you are remembering appears as something past and as something that you have experienced in the past are considered by some authors that as epistemic feelings. The suggestion I want to make in this talk is that there is a third feature. And the third feature in question is what the metaphor, the very widely used metaphor in the literature on episodic remembering of mental time travel tries to grasp. Usually people consider that the notion of mental time travel merely grasps, let's say, the phenomenology of episodic remembering. I think that this notion grasps a specific feature of this phenomenology. In my view, the mental time travel metaphor captures what I call presence. And to introduce in simple terms this notion, the idea is here that when someone mentally travels towards the past, it is to be back in the past and to feel present in the past. And usually when you travel, you want to stand somewhere and feel present in the place in question. Here is a quote by John Sutton that captures well, I think, what the notion of mental time travel tries to capture. He says, memory often takes us out of a current situation in remembering episodes of or experiences in my personal past. For example, I am mentally transported away from the social and physical setting in which I am currently embedded. Okay, so mental time travel, I think, is about presence. There are different senses that the notion of presence can have. Obviously, it can have a temporal notion, a temporal sense, sorry. That's not the sense in which I'm interested. It can also have locative sense. We can talk, and with Mike Barkazi, we propose to talk of the locative notion of presence or of locative presence. And this notion of locative presence encompasses two types of locative presence. The first one is the objective type, and it concerns the objects that you perceive in your direct environment. When you are perceiving an object, you are perceiving it as being there in your actual perceptual environment, in flesh and blood, to take a metaphor used by Husserl to capture this feature. So when you talk about being there directly in your perceptual environment, it can refer to the presence of objects. But the notion of locative presence can also refer to a subjective, let's say, the subjective aspect or side of presence. Subjects, experiencing subjects, feel being or standing in certain environments, in particular perceptual environments, but not only perceptual environment. I have already given some example. For instance, in mind wandering, you can feel present in a certain sense, a strong sense sometimes, in the scene that you are imagining. So the proposal that I make with this first premise is that the mental time travel phenomenology of remembering is about subjective locative presence in a past remembered scene. And I think it's a distinct third phenomenological feature of mental states of episodic remembering. Okay. This notion of subjective locative presence has to be elaborated further. Let me note first that it can occur in different mental states. I've talked about perceptual states. It's important to note that subjective locative presence can also occur in different types of mental states. It can occur in quasi-perceptual imagistic states. For instance, Jennifer Wint considers that dreams are immersive states. She defines dreams as immersive spatiotemporal hallucinations. And McGinn, talking about aesthetic experiences, says that we can be absorbed or immersed in fictional works. And Kampa talks about aesthetic transportation. Okay, so subjective locative presence can occur in such non-perceptual states, and it can occur also, I think, in episodic memories. And well, as for now, I just provide some intuitive or appealing examples. Subjective locative presence can occur in extreme pathological cases like PTSD. People feel like they were again in the scene that they are pathologically remembering. It can also occur in milder pathological cases, like, for instance, temporal epilepsy condition. There is a very interesting case described by Oliver Sacks, the case of Franco Manni, the Italian painter, who was haunted by vivid memories of his childhood village. And describing the case, Sacks says that Manni was transported to a time in the past, that he is in a sense there, living in the past. And I think that this description captures precisely the feature of the subjective locative presence. You can also, still in the case of memories, find more mundane cases, like in joint reminiscing, in flashback memories, or cases of our most cherished memories. So it seems, at least intuitively, that episodic remembering can be immersive in the sense that I have indicated, that is to say, as involving the feature of subjective locative presence, being there again, occupying again the perspective of the experience that we are remembering. Okay. More specifically, and that will be my last slide about immersion, if we try to be a bit more precise about that notion of immersion, and we try to do that with Mike in our paper, I think that we have to distinguish different types of immersion. In the paper, we propose to distinguish between embodied and unembodied immersion. Embodied immersion is the one based in particular on what we call sensory motor coupling. This is the type of immersion that we find when subjects are placed in virtual reality environments. In this case, one of the conditions to feel there in the virtual reality scene is that there is sensory motor coupling. Sensory motor coupling is about the systematic correlation between your body motions and your sensory inputs. If I move my head, my sensory inputs change, and there are some systematic correlations between these two things. And one of the conditions for instance, a virtuality environment to be immersive, to make the subjects feel there, is that there is such a sensory motor coupling. In this sense of immersion, I think that episodic remembering can hardly be considered as immersive. We can come back to that during the Q&A, but it seems hard to say that it is immersive in this sense. But there is a second sense to which I have actually alluded to earlier in the talk, which is the unembodied immersion. And in this case, what supports, one of the things at least that support the immersion is that we mentally self-project to a perspective, an experiential perspective within a certain imagistic mental state. And in this sense, distinct from the first sense, I think that episodic remembering can be immersive. So the proposal, when I say that mental time travel, notion of mental time travel captures a phenomenological feature of immersion, the proposal is to say that this phenomenological feature is immersion in the second sense that I've just distinguished. Of course, there are many pending questions here. You could ask me, but why should we, beyond the mere fact that in both cases we feel occupying a perspective in a certain scene, why should we say, why should we use the same notion of immersion? So that's a question, a fair question, interesting question. And what are the relationships between the two types of immersion that I've just distinguished? I won't tackle these issues right now. If you want, we can come back to them during the Q&A. So, okay, what will be my proposal once we have these notions in hand? My proposal will be that attention is a core factor of the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering. So let me turn to this notion of immersion and the role it plays, the phenomenological role it plays in quasi-perceptual imagistic states. Attention, for many people, contributes to the phenomenology of mental states, and in particular to the phenomenology of perceptual mental states in different ways. Some people like de Brigard and Prince have argued that attention is what gates perceptual mental states to consciousness. It's the first thing. But we can say, I think, that the contribution of attention to the phenomenology of perceptual mental states is richer. Watsall, in a very interesting chapter, develops the idea that attention shapes the phenomenology of perceptual states. And by this, he means two things. First, he says that attention boosts appearances. For instance, visual contrast, apparent size, apparent color saturation are boosted by attention. And there are some empirical work that establish that. But attention also structures experience. I quote Watsall, who says, attention structures consciousness into what is more central and what is more peripheral. And I give also a quote by James that says the same thing. So what is important for me here is to say that attention determines not only that the perceptual state is conscious, like some people at least argues, but also how the perceptual state in question is conscious. I will try to apply the same remark to non-perceptual state, but before doing that, I think that it's important, obviously, to define in more specific terms what attention is. There is no consensual definition of attention in the philosophy of attention. There is a field, a specific distinct field of philosophy of attention. As far as I know, I'm more a specialist of the philosophy of memory, much more. I'm not a specialist of the philosophy of attention, but as far as I see, there is no consensual definition. In this talk, I will use a definition provided by Chen and colleagues that has been quite important, both in philosophy and in psychology about attention. In particular, it has been used by de Brigard and Serve and colleagues more recently. So there is a bit of arbitrariness in that choice. Sorry. So we can come back to that and discuss that during the Q&A. But so, as for now, I will use that definition. The definition proposed by Chen and colleagues comprises two main points. The first one consists in saying that they are both external and internal attentions. There is both attention processing externally generated information, typically sensory input, and attention processing internally generated information, for instance, mental images. And of course, it's interesting to note that attention can be directed, let's say, toward the internal world. That will be particularly important for memory, obviously. The second point is that Chen and colleagues and de Brigard after them defines attention in terms of processing properties. According to them, what unifies all forms of attention, regardless of the distinct deepening mechanisms that support the forms of attention in question, is that they all share a set of three processing properties. First, there is selection of information. Attention determines which information is selected. Second, there is the modulation of information processing, and in particular, Chen and colleagues and others says that attention renders the processing of some information deeper and easier. And there is also vigilance that has to be conceived of in terms of sustaining attention. Chen and colleagues talk about the ability to sustain attention over extended periods of time. And I think that the two notions of selection of information and modulation of information processing are particularly interesting and important to understand the role played by attention in episodic remembering. So I will use that definition. Okay. Plausibly, external attention has phenomenological effects in perception due to its processing properties, the one that I've just distinguished, reported. For instance, if you take what Watzel says, you could say plausibly that the structuring of experience depends on the selection of attention, depending on which information, so the selection of information, depending on which information is selected, the experience will be structured differently. And the gating to consciousness and the boosting of appearances depends on the modulation of information processing. In this talk, so I will focus on selection and modulation. I will leave aside vigilance. And I think that we can say both for external and internal attention that the phenomenological effects of attention are due to these two processing properties of selection and modulation. So my proposal will be that if internal attention has a phenomenological role in quasi-perceptual imagistic states too, arguably it is due to its processing properties, in particular selection and modulation. Okay, so what I want to show with this notion of attention in hand is that internal attention shapes the phenomenology of non-perceptual imaginative mental states, not only of perceptual mental states. In particular, this is the idea I want to defend, switching attention to a fictional world and occupying a perspective in that world different from one's actual perspective, that is thereby left aside, screened off, makes these states immersive on the second sense of immersion that I have distinguished. Let me take two examples. In pretense, for instance, and in actor playing, we find this role played by attention, arguably. For instance, if someone engages in a play of pretense, we can imagine that little by little, this person will be ever more absorbed by the role, the pretended role that is played by the person in question. And so focusing on the perspective of a pretended character would render the pretense mental state more immersive. We have also, considering actor playing, famous examples of actors that have been completely absorbed by their character, by focusing their attention completely on the role they were playing. There is a very famous example of Jim Carrey that illustrates this remark. Attention plays arguably the same role in quasi-perceptual imagistic states. I have already given the quote by McGinn that argues for this idea. This immersive phenomenological feature of these non-perceptual states is due, I think, something that we can argue for the processing properties of attention. As one switches mentally to the perspective of a character, to the perspective of a pretended person, or to the perspective of a fictional world, selection occurs and modulation occurs. Regarding selection, for instance, as Liao talks about the role of attention in pretense, he uses the spotlight metaphor. He says that attention has to be considered as a spotlight, and obviously what he has in mind is the selection processes carried out by attention. Regarding modulation, we can argue the same thing. For instance, Kampa, talking about immersion in aesthetic experiences, talks about forgetting, that's the term he uses, the information that is not under the attentional focus. And I think that it is about selection and modulation. The fact that some information, due to the focus of attention, stops to be processed. Some information stops to be processed due to the orientation of attention. We could give other examples that would support the same kind of remark. And so the take-home message from these slides is that that the immersive character of these non-perceptual mental states is due to attention as characterized by the processing properties that I have introduced a bit earlier to define attention after John and colleagues. Okay, my proposal at this stage is that if these processing properties of attention are operative in episodic remembering too, then arguably the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering is due to these properties. So this leads me to memory specifically. And I want to show in this section of the talk that attention, as I have defined attention, that is to say through its processing properties, attention plays an immersive role in episodic remembering. In other words, the first premise must be explained at least in part in terms of the role played by attention in episodic remembering. Let me start this section by saying that over the two past decades, there have been growing evidence that attention plays a role in episodic recollection. There are significant both neural and behavioral evidence of the involvement of the processing properties of attention in episodic remembering. Some are reviewed by Dubrigard in two papers. First, there are neural evidence. The parietal lobe, that is known to play a crucial role in underpinning attentional activities, is now established as one of the components of the brain network that underpins episodic remembering. Like Dubrigard says, disagreements notwithstanding, everyone agrees in that the parietal lobe plays a critical role in the selection, modulation, and maintenance of internally generated information, and he applies this remark to episodic remembering in particular. There are also behavioral evidence. We know that there are detrimental effects on conscious episodic retrieval in divided attention tasks. And we also know that these effects, detrimental effects, are documented in cases of the impairment of parietal regions. So this suggests that remembering is attentionally demanding. If these evidence are conclusive, and a good amount of people consider that they are, then probably attention is operative in episodic remembering, and it is due to its processing properties, and due to these properties, I want to argue, it shapes the phenomenology of episodic remembering. So at this stage, my proposal is that if processing properties of attention occurs in episodic remembering, they explain, at least in part, the immersive phenomenology of this type of mental state. Let me be more specific about that. What I want to show in the two following slides is that the two processing properties of selection and modulation occurs in episodic remembering. And if this is right, then I will be in the position to objectively conclude that attention is a core factor of the immersive character of episodic remembering when it is immersive. First, selection occurs in remembering experiences, and it occurs in different ways. You have the selection of a certain memory. We know that there is a competition between different potential memories at a certain given time, and that this competition is resolved by the fact that attention focuses on such or such memory. There are even, I don't have time to develop that, but there are even some famous effects documented by the empirical literature that support this fact. For instance, the retrieval induced forgetting is an effect that supports the idea that there is a competition between memories. And so attention has to select a certain memory to retrieve it, and to render it conscious. There is also selection within a memory. You can select such or such component of a content of a state of remembering, and you can also select what is conscious in a state of remembering. By that, I mean that, for instance, you can be conscious of the fact that you are remembering, both of the fact that you are remembering, so of the attitude of remembering that you are entertaining, and of the content to which you relate through the attitude of remembering. But you can also focus your attention exclusively on the content of remembering. And in this case, by the way, arguably, you have something like an immersive effect of attention. Susanna Schellenberg argues for the same point about imaginative immersion. She says, when we immerse ourselves in a fictional world, we cease to be aware that we are imagining. So the fact that we are ceasing to be consciously, explicitly aware of the attitude from which we are related to a certain content can render, arguably, the content in question immersive. And you have also, and I think that it's a crucial point, the selection of the mode of remembering. There are empirical studies, in particular, there is a very nice recent paper by Survey and colleagues about that. You have empirical studies of what happens when we switch our attention from external attention to the perceptual environment to internal attention to a certain memory. This is what Survey and colleagues call attentional switch to memory. And they say that as one is remembering, one switches from external to internal attention with cognitive engagement of memory capacities and disengagement of perceptual capacities. And there are, I don't have time to develop that, but there are empirical, let's say more refined empirical studies of the relationship between internal and external attention. And some people like Dixon and colleague says that in the case in which an episode of remembering is voluntary and effortful, the external attention is completely cancelled. They say as soon as one of them, sorry, I give the full quote, internal and external attentional processes compete for the same resources. Internal and external attention can coexist only when they are spontaneous and do not require voluntary processes. As soon as one of them is voluntary and effortful, it cancels the other one. Okay, so selection obviously occurs at different levels or stages of episodic remembering. That's the same thing for modulation. First, attention renders a memory conscious in the first place by a specific modulation of the memory information. As the regard says, internal attention gets memories into consciousness. But modulation occurs in further ways. It has, in particular, a negative processing effect in remembering. Take what I just said about attentional switch to memory. This switch diminishes or frankly stops, in some cases, the processing of sensory inputs. So that's about the modulation of information processing. And modulation has also a positive processing effect in remembering. Probably it has a boosting effect on the taking of a perspective towards which a subject self-projects. So it seems that both modulation and selection, these two processing properties constitutive of attention, occurs in episodic remembering state. So at this stage, here is the way I reason. Given that episodic remembering can be immersive, that the attentional processing properties of selection and modulation have an immersive role in other quasi-perceptual imagistic states, and that they are operative in episodic remembering, I think that we can conclude objectively that attention plays a core role in the mental time travel phenomenology of episodic remembering. And this is, I think, quite appealing. If you take the case, if you take what I have said about the attentional switch to memory, it seems pretty intuitive that such a switch can render the content of the episodic remembering state immersive. Okay, so I've been talking for almost 40 minutes. I have 5 minutes, perfect. Okay, that will be amply enough, thanks. So let me move on to the last section of the talk. And to put it roughly, the section in question is a caveat. The objective argument that I just developed provides support to the claim that attention plays a role in the immersive character of episodic remembering when episodic remembering is actually immersive. I'm not saying that it's always immersive. I'm saying that it can be that it is sometimes immersive. The caveat consists in saying that, well, maybe other factors play a role in the immersive character of episodic remembering. And something that permits to develop, to elaborate this caveat is a recent debate, recent attention or attitude debate about imaginative immersion. The issue at stake in this debate is it a specific attitude, or are there attentional resources that render an imaginative state immersive? You have two views, two approaches defended in this debate. You have the attitudinal approach, that is the prevailing view, defended in particular by Susanna Schellenberg, that says that immersion in quasi-perceptual imaginative states is due to a certain attitude, an attitude of pretense. And it says that as one feels being in a certain place that one is quasi-perceptually imagining, one represents themselves as if they were actually there. And relating, according to that view, to an imagined scene through the as-if mode of pretense would provide immersion into this scene. So Schellenberg has a more, you can imagine, refined account. She says that pretense attitude is a complex attitude made of belief and imagination. I'm not going to develop that. We can come back to that during the Q&A. And you also have, in the minority, you have also have an attentional approach to the immersive character of certain imaginative states. Liao, for instance, say very clearly, immersion is a switch in attention. And he says that as one feels being in a certain place that one is quasi-perceptually imagining, one focuses one's attention on the imagined scene. And this is, according to him, this attention focus that provides the immersion into the scene in question. So if you have in mind the third three sections, you can imagine that I am ready to endorse the attentional approach. Actually, I have a qualified agreement with Liao's view. I think that his view is insufficiently detailed. I think that we need a very specific definition of attention to understand its immersive role in episodic remembering. And I also think that his view is mistakenly exclusive. I don't see why, because attention plays an immersive role in the phenomenology of episodic remembering, other factors could not. For instance, attitudinal factors could not also play a role in the immersive phenomenology of episodic remembering. That will be my final remark. We defend with Mike Barkazi precisely a two-factor approach to immersion in episodic remembering in our paper, dubbed immersivism. And we think that both attitudinal and attentional factors play a role. And it's interesting to note, by the way, that the people in the relevant literature are not always clear precisely about which factor plays a role. For instance, Schellenberg, who officially endorses the attitudinal approach, has some remarks that makes room, significant room, to attention. She says, for instance, the most relevant characteristic of imaginative immersion is that the subject does not consciously think about the fact that she is imagining. She is immersed in fiction. And there she seems to be talking about attention, the fact that the attitude of imagining is screened off because of certain orientation, direction of the attentional focus. And Campa, who is a proponent of the attentional view, has some remarks that make room for an attitude in the immersive character of episodic remembering. So if I had to endorse a view about, a complete view about immersion in episodic remembering, I would, at least so far, endorse a two-factor approach. Okay, so let me conclude very briefly now. What is the take-home message of this talk? I have said that episodic remembering can be immersive and sometimes is immersive. And I've also said that this is precisely what the mental time travel metaphor gestures toward. I have offered an abductive argument to claim that attention, defined in terms of a set of processing properties, plays a core role in the mental time travel phenomenology of episodic remembering. Specifically, I have said that due to selection and modulation, the episodically remembering subject can feel there again in the personal scene that they are remembering. And therefore, if my argument is correct, the study of the phenomenology of episodic remembering should make room both for a further feature, the immersive feature, and a further factor, that is to say, attention. And however, I did not claim, let me be clear about that attention is necessary for immersion, nor that it underpins only the immersive feature of episodic remembering. There are some papers in the literature suggesting that attention can play a phenomenologic role beyond its immersive role. I'm done. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Denis, for the brilliant talk. We have some questions in the comments. I will start by with a question by Cesar.
Yep.
So Cesar asked about the degrees of attention. So is there a correlation between the degree of attention and the deepness of immersion? So this is the first question he made.
Okay. Should I reply in turn or?
As you want. But yeah, you may reply.
Okay. So yeah, definitely, Cesar. I would say yes. I mean, it's something that I have not mentioned, but I should. And in the paper with Mike, we talk about that. Attention is immersion is something that comes in degree. You can be more or less immersed to the effect that you feel more or less there in the remembered scene. So it is definitely something that comes in degree. It's, by the way, that fact can provide an argument for, let's say, multiple factors account of immersion. If you have several factors, in a sense, it's easier to say to explain the fact that immersion comes in degree, depending on the factors that are actually operative in the state of episodic remembering. So yes, definitely. And there was another point in César's remark, I think.
Yeah, he asked about
his attention.
His attention.
Cognitive phenomenon. Do you have in mind when you mentioned type 2, you mean immersion type 2 or type 2 when we...
I believe he's talking about these two kinds of systems, the system that is automatic.
Okay, dual processing.
And the two kinds of processing. Yeah,
model.
Like the fast and slow by Daniel. I forgot his last name.
I couldn't say. That's an interesting question. I don't know. Well, most of people who work on attention are ready to say that you have both, let's say, bottom-up, voluntary, and top-down, and bottom-up involuntary and top-down voluntary types of attention. For instance, something that is salient in your perceptual environment captures your attention independently of your will to do that. On the contrary, you can thoughtfully focus your attention, for instance, on a certain mathematical content to calculate. And so obviously you have these two kinds of attention, and you have voluntary and involuntary automatic types of attention, let's say. That suggests, but merely suggests, that the distinction between type 1 and type 2 processes, cognitive processes, can apply here. I'm not sure. I would need to give more thought to that. But the fact that there is both effortful, voluntary, and automatic type of attention is pretty clear. Yeah.
Great. There is a related question by Professor Beatriz. She asked, "Can you say more about the role of attention in the selection of involuntary memory?" So
I just can't. Is there even an empirical literature on that? I don't know. Specifically on that involuntary memory, I don't know. I'm not sufficiently specialist of the empirical literature on that point. I couldn't say. Yeah. But what do you have in mind, Beatrice? Why are you asking that question?
Let's wait for her to answer. While she answers, we have a question by Gabriel Zaccaro. He asked, do you believe that selection in action can be argument pro discontinuism? Just to explain discontinuism here to someone that is not familiar. So discontinuism is the view that memory and imagination are different kinds of mental states. So do you believe that selection in attention can be argument for this view that memory and imagination are different kinds of mental states? Would selection in attention of memory be easier than in imagining, given its underlying narrative structure? That's an interesting question.
To my knowledge, we don't have empirical evidence about, let's say, attentional processes being easier in memory than in imagination. There is evidence, and that's interesting, but it's a bit different. that attention is more strongly, in general, more strongly involved in episodic remembering relative to semantic remembering. It's more difficult to disengage from an episodic memory task than from a semantic memory task. There are empirical evidence that document that, but about imagination and remembering, no, I don't know, but that's interesting. Should we have that if discontinuism is right? Why should we have that? I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure that we should have that if discontinuism is right, but it's an interesting question. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Great. We have now a question by Juan.
Yeah.
So Juan asked, do you think that a consequence of your argument is that there is no such thing as a sui generis phenomenology of remembering, as immersion is involved not only in memory but in different imagistic mental states? So
yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't say that. Again, immersion is just one potential phenomenological features amongst other ones. So if you say that, let's say that the phenomenology of episodic remembering is a set of phenomenological features, you can say that immersion is a feature that is shared by other mental states than episodic remembering, while episodic remembering still having a specific phenomenology. In particular, the feeling of pastness seems to be, well, it's controversial, but one can argue that it's something specific, that it's something specific of episodic remembering. So I don't think that that saying that immersion can be a phenomenological feature of episodic remembering, and that this feature is shared by other mental state of a different type from the type of episodic remembering. I don't think that saying that commits to saying that there is no specific phenomenology of episodic remembering.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also agree with that. So just to say that Beatrice answered that her question was similar to Cesar's, so you already answered it. I have two questions. It's about the relation of this work with your previous work. So the first one is related to, you said that there is an embodied immersion and unembodied immersion. So and you said that probably this mental time travel is unembodied immersion.
Yeah. Probably.
So yeah, my question is, how does it relate with your previous work in which you argues for the role of the body and the embodiment of memory? And especially considering two examples that you gave here with cases that seems to be really embodied cases of memory, like the PTSD that people seem to be quite immersed in the past. And this has real embodied consequences. And also the example you gave by Oliver Sacks. So that's my first question.
Okay.
And the second question is, how does the immersion differs from an epistemic feeling? So I'm thinking about the relation between, for example, immersion and the feeling of ownership. Can we have a strong feeling of ownership without having immersion or something like that? Or can we have some strong immersion without the feeling of ownership? And whether immersion could have an epistemic function. So that's both are my questions.
Okay, thanks. These are great points. Regarding embodiment, embodiment is a vague term. I mean, it can refer to very, very different things. What I've said in some papers about the possibly embodied character of episodic remembering was not about sensory motor coupling, obviously. It was not about that. And it was not about either about experiential features or phenological features. For instance, when I talk about the potential role of eye movements in the construction of mental images in states of episodic remembering, the movement in question are not supposed to be things that you experience. They are supposed to be processes that underpin the construction of a mental image. But in the mental image that is conscious, I don't say that the eye movements in question are involved in any sense. So when I talk about the embodied potential, embodied character of episodic remembering, I'm talking about underpinning constructive processes specifically. So yeah, your question is interesting because, of course, I'm talking about unembodied immersion in this talk, and I'm talking about the embodied character of episodic remembering in some papers. But I think I'm really talking about very different things, and the term embodiment refers to different things in these two contexts. So this is my reply to your first question. Your second question, immersion as an epistemic feeling. And so that's interesting because if your suggestion were right, then the claim I try to argue for that immersion has to be distinguished in particular from the second set of phenological features that I have distinguished would be weakened. If I wanted to be mean, I would say, well, the burden of the proof is on your side. I mean, show me that immersion can be conceptualized in terms of an epistemic feeling. An epistemic feeling says something about a first-order mental state. Immersion is about how you experience the mental state in question. It does not say anything, for instance, about the source of a mental state in question. You were talking about the feeling of ownership. If you conceptualize the feeling of ownership in terms of an epistemic feeling, you will say, well, this feeling, the content of this feeling is about the source of the mental state in question. It says, well, I have experienced that's experiential scene that I am remembering, that I'm representing, and so that I'm remembering. So you can, and many people do that, conceptualize such feelings or feeling of vastness in terms of epistemic feelings. How could you conceptualize the immersive feature in terms of an epistemic feeling? I'm not sure of seeing how we could do that. That would be yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just say that. So at least your answer clarified me that the distinction clarified to me the distinction between the epistemic feeling, that is the second level that you propose, and the third level, because it was more clear now, because the immersion is then a feeling about the experience itself of remembering, not about the past experience or the source of the remember or something like that. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm not sure. That's interesting. As immersion, that's very interesting. Should we characterize immersion as a feeling? Should we say that immersion as a content if we accept that such a feature exists? I think that's an interesting question that I should consider. Yeah. But I would not be ready to say that immersion is an epistemic feeling. I don't see how we could say that. What we should say, I think, and we say that with Mike in the paper, is that the epistemic feeling of pastness, let's say, determines the immersion to the effect that it determines the temporal orientation of the immersion. You immerse yourself into your past, into the past, and you could say that the feeling of ownership also determines immersion in episodic remembering to the effect that it is an immersion into a past personal perspective. So I'm not saying that let's say that the levels 2 and 3 are completely independent one from the other. I don't think that we should say that, but I insist that there are 2 different levels. Well, so far, I would say so. Yeah.
Perfect. We have the last question by Cesar. So he asked, attention can be defined as a state of being alert. What about immersion in dreams? Are we alert when dreaming in some sense?
What do you mean by being alert? Is it just a synonym of attention, or do you have something more specific in mind?
Maybe being responsive to the content of.
Okay, so if this is what you have, and Cesar has in mind, it corresponds to the modulation feature of attention. So what about immersion in dreams? The fact that attention is okay, maybe I see what you have in mind, Cesar. Attention can be involuntary, like we said earlier, in particular in response to a question. So you can perfectly say that attention is operative in dreams and contributes to the immersive character of dreams in, let's say, by being, let's say, operative in an involuntary way. You don't have to say that you deliberately, voluntarily apply, let's say, exercise your attentional capacities, but you have to do that in dreams for dreams to be immersive. You would have to say that if attention could only be voluntary or deliberate, and obviously it's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we are gonna finish, wrap up the discussion. Thanks again, Denis, for accepting, and thanks for the amazing talk. So this talk will be available on this same link on YouTube. So if anyone wants after that, we also may interact in the comments, etc.
Sure.
And you may be interested because Denis is organizing a workshop in memory and attention in the next week. So if you follow him in his social media, you can find more information about that. So,
yeah, thanks a lot for advertising. All the informations are on the website of the Center for Philosophy of Memory. Okay. So you're welcome, of course. And thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks for the great questions. That was really helpful.
Great. So bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.